indicator of progress that people and government look at is economic growth or gross domestic product, GDP. However, in 2010, two Nobel laureates in economics, Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz, were part of a book entitled Mismeasuring Our Life, Why GDP Doesn't Add Up. Moreover, in 2011, United Nations adopted, in my opinion, one of the most remarkable resolutions of recent times, happiness toward a holistic approach to development, where a strong criticism was made of the GDP as a measure of progress. At the same time, United Nations made a call to the state members, to government, to put happiness at the center of public policies. My question is, I would like to ask you, what do you think about GDP as a measure of progress and this call, Nobel laureates, United Nations, what is the best measure for progress, for development, for quality of life?
Well, I think well-being is the best measure, the right measure. And income, of course, is one of the factors that affects it, but it's only one of many factors. And in fact, if you look in most countries, you will find that the spread of happiness is explained first by the spread of mental and physical illness in the country. Second, it's explained by the differences in people's human relationships, whether they have a family and whether the family life is good, whether they have work and whether the work relationships are good, and whether they feel safe and happy in their communities. And only after that comes income as a factor explaining the differences within the community. So we've got to get income in its place when we think about what makes for a happy life. And I think that applies to policymakers. It applies also, of course, to individuals when they make their choices. But it was a very important report that you mentioned, commissioned originally by President Sarkozy of France. The UN resolution was important, and there have been important resolutions more recently, both by the OECD and by the European Council, saying, let's put people's well-being at the heart of policy making. The issue is how to make this happen. What is really important is an adequate information base so that we can look at policies, not in terms of what do they do for GDP, which will have a smallish effect perhaps on well-being, but what do they do directly for the well-being of the people relative to the cost to the taxpayer. And that is a campaign which a group of us have been pushing. It's one reason why we founded the World Wellbeing Movement, to push governments to collect the information so that they can make judgments on policy changes, because they have found out by experimentation how much difference the policies do make to people's well-being. I think this will produce, and this is what will happen, of course, over the next 25 years. This will become common and standard practice, and I think it will produce a happier world.
I know that it's a complex construct, but for example, is it possible to measure happiness?
Yeah, it is possible to measure people's happiness by asking them questions, like the question, how satisfied are you with your life? We know that the answers are meaningful. For example, they are very good predictors of all kinds of things, like whether a person will quit his job, quit his marriage, her marriage, whether they will quit this life, not by suicide, also by ordinary mortality. Happiness is a very good predictor of mortality. It's quite a good predictor of voting. Many, many things validate this measure. And I think it's really important that we use this measure a great deal more, both in our workplaces and, of course, in our schools and in our community as a whole. So we launched, a group of us, 2 months ago, the World Wellbeing Movement. And this is a coalition of major famous multinational companies who are supporting the idea that companies should measure the well-being of their workers and use that as a way of informing them about how better to organize life at work, and also, of course, as an aid to the productivity of the company. Because the research which my colleagues have done, mainly at Oxford, shows very clearly that when workers are happier with their lives, they perform better. And this is a very, very important factor of production, the well-being of workers. So it matters for itself, but it also matters for the bottom line. And then you said, well, is there anything that can be done to improve it? There is now an increasing weight of evidence that things can be done to change it. I'll just tell you one more measurement event, which I think was very important, which was when Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, when he measured how happy people were different times of day and in different places, he found that they were least happy, you can perhaps guess when they were with their boss. Now, this is a very serious reflection, isn't it, on our managerial practices. And I think it means that we should take the evidence as how to improve people's well-being very seriously, particularly when it concerns the working of people in teams with the team leader. So there was a very important experiment, the so-called STAR experiment, sponsored by MIT and other universities, to facilitate, through the presence of a facilitator, team meetings where the team leader and the members of the team met on a regular basis to discuss how the work of the team could be organized in a way that was better both for the workers and for the performance of the team, and therefore the benefit to the employer. And this was found to have an extraordinary effect on the well-being of the workers and also reduced the quitting rate by 1/3, which is very important from the point of view of the employer. So there are things that can be done, and I could go on and on, but maybe we'll come back to it.
Sometimes we talk about well-being, sometimes we talk about happiness. What do you prefer, or do you see any difference between both in your personal terms?
No, I don't see any difference. I think some people feel awkward about saying that happiness should be the measure of success for a society, for various reasons. I think one reason is that they think maybe happiness is not that important, happiness is a lollipop or whatever. But actually, that's not how people talk. I mean, if I ask you, are you happy in your marriage, that's a rather serious question. Or if I ask you, is your child happy at school? That's a pretty central question. Or indeed, are you happy in your own work? These are really central questions. So I think that I like the word happiness, but people who feel slightly embarrassed by it like to use the word well-being. But there's another issue that comes up, which is, of course, that we want people to contribute very much to the happiness of other people. So it looks as if we're kind of encouraging selfishness when we say that happiness is a measure of the success of a society. Of course, it doesn't encouraging selfishness, because the society won't be happy if each person is just pursuing their own happiness. It requires people to contribute a lot to the happiness of other people, as well as themselves, to have a happy society. So that's another reason why some people don't like to use the word happiness, and they use the word well-being, but that doesn't even really capture the idea that, of course, a good life is not necessarily quite the same as a happy life. There are some people who are really making other people happy, but are themselves suffering. Doing good for others is a good way to make yourself feel better, but it's still the case that virtue and happiness are not the same thing. And that's one reason why people don't like to use the word happiness. But I think that's a confusion. Virtue is the means, happiness is the end. The happiness of the society is the proper and, I think, inspiring and noble objective.
And you mentioned a key point for me. What do you think about human nature? Because standard economic theory assumes that we are selfish, intrinsically selfish, say some disciplines. Well, not only economists, there are some psychologists who also think in the same way. But for example, I noticed that in the last World Happiness Report, you gave a strong importance to benevolence, for example. So how could we understand this? I don't know, it's a paradox, but mainly, are we selfish? Are we altruistic? What do you think? It's a very strong debate here.
Well, I think that we have elements of both in us. I think there is a bit of us which thinks we are the most important person in the world. But there's a bit of us which just wants to help other people. And I think almost everybody, if somebody asks them to help them, feels they'd like to do it. They sometimes don't feel they can do it. But nearly everybody actually would like to help somebody who needed helping. So I think it's been very central to the success of the human species that people do want to help each other. So then we come to the question of culture, and what is the purpose of culture. And I think one really key purpose of culture is to tilt the balance within the human value system towards the unselfish end of the pole. And I personally think that this idea that the way you live should be to try and create as much happiness as you can in the world is a very inspiring ideal. I would like it to be something which people come in contact with at the age of primary school. That's it's not just you ought to do this and that, but what we should be doing is trying to contribute to the happiness of other people as much as we can. And that would be, to my mind, the best description of virtue. And of course, it then has to be applied in ways that actually do bring about that result. And perhaps I could just mention, actually, Wenceslao, that we founded a movement, and there's many members in Chile, called Action for Happiness, which is a bottom-up movement of people who they pledge to try to create as much happiness in the world as they can, and as little misery. And they are supported by the movement, both online and in face-to-face gatherings, to live that sort of life. I think that's very important. I think if we want to have a happier world, we've got to have two things. First, we've got to have a transformative movement to transform people in the way they live, a bottom-up movement. And we've also got to have, as we were talking earlier, a top-down movement where policymakers themselves are also targeting the happiness of their population or the happiness of their workforce.
I know very well Action for Happiness is a wonderful movement. I was part of it when I was doing my PhD in Brighton, the Action for Happiness in Brighton.
Very good. Well, you recognize this.
Of course. Of course. Of course. And you know, I think you know very well Matthew Ricard.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a wonderful person. He came to Chile and stayed with us 1 week approximately. And he always said that every person truly happy, there were persons that always learned to serve others. So, altruistic person. So Matthew used to say altruism is linked very strongly to happiness. So happier people, on average, is more altruistic, and when you're more altruistic, you're happier. So I think this is the kind of movement. You said we need a transformative movement. Now, Professor Layard, you are one of the editors of the World Happiness Report, along with Jeffrey Sachs and John Helliwell. I love the report. I read it every year. So thank you for
Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you know 1 million people read it each year, it's remarkable.
Just to understand some of your findings, what would you say are the main sources of happiness? Because you have I understand you have a model. You run regression and statistics analysis. In short, what would you say are the most important determinants of happiness across the world?
Well, I think when we talk about this, it's easiest to think about things which create more or less happiness within one society, and then things which explain the differences between societies. They're not quite the same things. For example, within a society, mental health is incredibly important in explaining how happy or not a person is. But across societies, mental health is pretty similar in most societies. So it doesn't explain the variation between societies. So if I could just do it that way, within societies, health is extraordinarily important, then human relationships, as I was saying, and then income. But across societies, there are, of course, big cultural differences between societies, and the most successful ones if you use the Gallup poll data, are ones which have effective systems of social support, where people feel that they will be supported if they are in difficulty. Ones in which there is also some adequate degree of personal freedom. So there's the social support, but there's also the freedom. There's, of course, the absence of corruption. And then there's this altruistic element that you were talking about so much. So measurements of generosity are also big factors explaining the differences in happiness between countries and differences in trust. So the Scandinavian countries, as I think most people know, are the happiest countries. This is because they score so highly on trust. They are so based on the ethos that we want to concentrate on the things we have in common rather than try and show how different we are all the time. So they are less individualistic and competitive and more solidaristic or mutually supportive and respectful than most other societies. And of course, following from that, they have good institutions for protecting people who are vulnerable or unfortunate. So I think the Scandinavian countries are quite a model that we can all learn from if you want to create a happier society.
In Chile, we have seen a growing trend regarding mental health problems, and many of them are coming from the workplace. Indeed, Jeffrey Pfeffer, professor at the Stanford University Business School, published a book in 2018 entitled Dying for a Paycheck. Excessive competition, job insecurity, and a lack of autonomy will be some of the reason behind this problem. So in our audience, there's a lot of business leaders. What message would you say to them if we really want to improve mental health in organizations? What leaders need to do? What owners need to do? What kind of change need the workplace, according to you?
Well, I think there are some positive things and some negative things. I think that on the positive side, we know that people are happier when they feel they have some control over their lives, including their life at work. And that's why I think that the experiment I mentioned before, which gave team members more of a say in the way the work is arranged, were so much better off in terms of happiness than ones which are extremely top down in the way that they are structured. Of course, so individuals need to have, of course, clear goals set to them, but then they need to have much more control than often is the case in how they discharge those goals. And of course, they also need support. That's a sort of standard theory of work organization. But there's another thing, which is pay. And I think something terrible has happened due to my profession. The economists have said it's incredibly important that people are paid as precisely as possible, exactly for the contribution that they make, even to the work of a team, where you can't identify in any simple, objective way what each person contributes. And so we've got these elaborate systems of individual performance-related pay, forced ranking of people in teams, causing enormous insecurity and hurt to the people who don't come up as high in the ranking as they feel they should do. And it produces completely the wrong atmosphere in terms of the relations between fellow workers, because working for a team is one of the most satisfying things you can do, like playing for a team, working for a team. These are some of the great inspiring things in life. And to be, instead of that, competing against fellow members of the team is a source of unhappiness. So, for example, there was a study of 4 Danish companies which introduced performance-related pay, and the number of workers on antidepressants immediately went up by 10%. That's quite remarkable. And in general, studies which have been done trying to compare well-being of workers in companies where or workplaces where the pay is based on the team performance as compared with on individually ranked performance, show that workers are definitely happier when the pay is based on the performance of the team. And that just relates to this basic feature of human nature, that people enjoy cooperation. Competition can be quite good fun on the foot, in sport and so on, but it's not great as a feature of everyday life at the workplace.
Wow, your message is wonderful. I love the self-determination theory. It's a theory developed in the 70s, the University of Rochester by Richard Ryan and Edward Deci. And they propose that human beings have 3 psychological needs that they need to be fulfilled in order to function optimally. And as you say, for example, autonomy is very important, social support, social relationships, stop competing, more collaboration. And now they are testing if, for example, benevolence could be an additional psychological need. So all what you have said is a key message for companies and organizations. So do you think, or do you believe that there is an ethical and moral duty for organizations in terms of building the conditions in order their employees can be happier and flourish?
I certainly do. I mean, we have work both to satisfy the needs of customers, but also it's a huge part of the life of the workers. And it can't make any sense at all if we are not trying to offer a satisfying life to the people that we employ. So in this World Wellbeing Movement that we recently launched, which includes the S&P 500, the S&P company as one of its sponsoring members, wow. We are pushing that the environmental, social, and governance ratings of companies should, as regards the social element, be focused on the well-being of workers. That would mean that employers would have to, if they want to have a good score, they should be able to, one, measure the well-being of their workers, and 2, do that in a way that is comparable with other companies. So be a standard questionnaire that was hopefully used by Standard & Poor's when they produce the ESG ratings. So I think this is a very practical way in which we could get well-being up to being a higher priority for business leaders. Very encouraging, of course, has been the statement by the US Business Roundtable in 2019 that companies have obligations not only to the shareholders but also to their workers, customers and suppliers. That's a strong ethical basis for taking these other obligations seriously. And I think it's wonderful that we now do have the ESG movement, which where investors are providing an incentive for that reorientation of the values of companies.
It's a very good news because if we start measuring things, we can manage it. So I hear you, I think like many years ago, I think you say something like in Spanish is, si no medimos algo, no lo hacemos. If we don't measure something, we don't work on it, or something like that.
Well, it sounds, if I can say, it sounds better in English. If we treasure it, we should measure it. And the other thing is, other way around is, if we don't measure it, it suggests we don't treasure it. These regressions. So I think it's clear that it is hugely important, and we've got quite good, convincing measurements of trust, largely because they are so well correlated with the results of these experiments, where wallets have been left in the street, and the researchers have measured what fraction of them get returned to their owners, which is something like 100% in Scandinavia, and I think well under 50% in many South American countries. So these trust measures are important. We've got empirical evidence that they do affect well-being. If you ask me, how can we improve trust? I think it is a matter of the fundamental value system of the country. And that is obviously transmitted through all kinds of institutions, from faith organizations to schools. But the schools are particularly, obviously, important, and instruments which the state has control over. And I feel very strongly that the schools are at the moment going in the wrong direction in countries which I'm most aware of, towards pushing children from the idea that they should be developing into decent adults who make a contribution to the life of the community, away from that idea to the idea that the duty of the child, of each individual, is to themselves, to make the most of themselves, which typically means to be more successful than other people in the grades they get at school, in the jobs they get, and the incomes they get, possibly in the partner they get. But the competition is becoming increasingly intense, and you can see that in questionnaires that are asked to students about how much they value, making a contribution as opposed to making a buck. This has got to be reversed. I think the schools are the obvious instrument to do this. I mean, there should be a serious movement to promote the idea that the pure pursuit of success is actually vulgar and really rather disgusting. We know that in some primitive communities that was very, very strongly established and helped to contribute to the success of the human species. And we've got to go back to it. The competition is not to be glorified. To do something just in order to do better than other people is not a noble deed. There are much more noble deeds and things which will ultimately give you more satisfaction.
Wow. Thank you very much for this message. Professor Layard, it has been a really, really nice conversation. thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate your insight, your knowledge, your suggestion. On behalf of Acción Empresa, we really want to say thank you for sharing all the things with us and with our audience.
Well, Wenceslao, I want to thank you for the wonderful questions and wisdom that you have been putting into this discussion we've been having. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope others have too.
Well, thank you again, and you know that the first book I read in my life about happiness was your book, the book published in 2005, Happiness, Lessons from a New Science, and I think it changed my life and my career completely. So thank you again, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.